Okay, today I want to continue talking about the five ranks of Tozan, or Dongshan as he's known by his Chinese pronunciation. And I'm going to start today on the first rank of the absolute and relative. And there's two distinct series of poems that I'm going to say Tozan wrote. And this is one of them. We'll get to the second one later. But there's five verses that he wrote. The first one is called the absolute containing the relative. And the verse goes like this: early in the evening, before the moon shines, no wonder they meet without knowing each other. But there is still the fascination of earlier beauty. So, when we look at all five of these ranks, they imply a progression of starting at a certain stage in our practice and then progressing. But in these ranks of relative and absolute, it's important to remember that each rank contains all of the others. And particularly this first one we're going to talk about today supports all the others, and they are included within it, and it is included within them. And Aiken Roshi calls these modes rather than ranks to de-emphasize the notion of progression. So I've been thinking of calling them positions, but they've been called ranks for so long in our tradition. I'll slip back and forth probably. As I said, there's two sets of these five ranks. The one I'm going to start talking about today is called HenSho Go-I, where Hen means relative and Sho means absolute. And Go-I is translated as five ranks. Go is five in Japanese. In some translations, Hen is called phenomena or apparent, and Sho is called real or universal. So, but I like relative and absolute. And I have about 6 different translations. And some of them I say the absolute containing the relative, and some of them say phenomena within the real, or the phenomenon within the universal, or the apparent within the real. I'm going to use relative and absolute. And the second set of the five ranks are called the Koken Go-I, which means the five ranks of the sequence of merit. And this set is more progressive or linear than the other set. In many ways, it is akin to the 10 ox herding pictures. And we'll see that as we discuss them in later talks, where you start at the first stage and then progress through the different stages. But whereas the HenSho Go-I are more circular and more, I don't know, more like a Indra's net where everything reflects everything else. So the translation I have for HenSho Go-I, the first of them, is the absolute containing the relative. And the Chinese characters are Shou, Chu, Hen, where Chu, which is the middle character, actually means middle. And, in Buddhism, we talk about the middle way. That's Chu Do, the middle way. So if we translate it as containing or within, it means that the relative is bigger than the absolute, or the absolute is bigger than the relative, depending on which one, because the first one, is the first of the five ranks is the absolute containing the relative, and the second one is a relative containing the absolute. But each one of them is complete and whole, and one's not larger than the other. So contain implies that there's a piece of one inside the other. So I want to disavow that interpretation right away. Because when we chant the Heart Sutra, we say form is emptiness and emptiness is form. You don't say that form contains emptiness or emptiness contains form. So we can say the relative is the absolute, absolute is a relative, and one doesn't contain the other. Or maybe we can say that the absolute emerges from the relative, or the relative emerges from the absolute. But these absolute and relative are not the usual absolute and relative that we might conceptually think about, because sometimes the absolute is relative, and that's the stage that we're talking about now. And sometimes the absolute is absolute, which is stage 3, and sometimes the relative is absolute, which is stage 2, and sometimes the relative is relative, which is stage 4 when we go through it. And hopefully some of this will become clear further on in these talks. So in this first rank of the relative containing the absolute, the student experiences the realm of emptiness. In deep samadhi with no self-awareness, the empty sky vanishes and the iron mountain crumbles. And Master Hakuin said, above heaven, there's not a tile covers her head, and below, not an inch of ground for her to stand on. In other words, it's like vast space. And in this state, the delusive passions become non-existent. And enlightenment is non-existent. Samsara is non-existent. Nirvana is non-existent. It's a state of total emptiness without sound, odor, like a bottomless, clear pool. However, if the student clings to this, she's called stagnant water. Or Hakuin says, an evil spirit keeping watch over the corpse in the coffin. And this state can become a hiding place of quietude, passivity, and vacantness. So not only does the verse talk about this state, but it also talks about the cautions about the pitfalls of this state. But Hakuin says the great perfect mirror wisdom is perfectly revealed by, strange to say, he says it's like black lacquer bowl. So the great perfect mirror wisdom just reflects everything as it is. Doesn't add anything extra. So when a devil appears, the devil's reflected. When an angel appears, an angel's reflected. But you can't see what this wisdom mirror is, and if you try to express it, you keep falling into error. Some practitioners regard this as the be-all and end-all of Zen practice. To call it this an error is too weak a term. They loll complacently in self-absorption and declare everything to be void. And Hakuin warned, he whose activity does not leave this rank falls into the poisonous sea. As long as he hides in the place of quietude and passivity, when he comes into contact with the differentiations conditions of turmoil and confusion, love and hate, he'll find himself hopeless before them. And all of the miseries of existence will press in upon him. So Hakuin said in order to save him from this serious illness, Tozan developed a second rank as an expedient. And we'll get to the second rank next week on Saturday, but today we're going to talk about the first rank. So he may only have one leg, and then we'll get the second leg next week. So then you can walk in balance. So let's consider the individual lines of the poem. Early in the evening before the moon shines, no wonder they meet without knowing each other. But there's still the fascination of earlier beauty. So early in the evening before the moon shines, before the moon comes up, if you're living out in the country like we do here, although there's still lights out here, it's dark, right? The sky's dark, it's difficult to see. Some of the translations say at the beginning of the third watch. I guess that, and the town crier would go around at different times in the city and shout out, the third watch and all is well. The third watch is also implies the same thing. It's a time of the night when it's dark. So this line is a description of emptiness. When one experiences a dropping off of body and mind, there's no self and no other, no subject and no object. And then Hakuin called it a black lacquer bowl. See, no light escapes from a black lacquer bowl. It's like a black hole in our galaxy. Light can go in, but it can't come out. I've heard this description of black lacquer bowl in another case of Master Seppo, who was a student of Tozan, and he called himself a black lacquer bowl, but it wasn't a compliment. He said wisdom comes in, but no wisdom goes out. He was saying that he was a dull student, and eventually he had an awakening and he became quite an important figure in our tradition. So talking about this first line, Hakuin expressed it very clearly in it was in another writing called The Four Ways of Knowing. He said, when discriminating mind is suddenly shattered and the awakened essence immediately appears, the universe is filled with boundless light. This light, this is called the way of knowing of the great perfect mirror, the pure body of reality. This is realization all at once. So this pure body of reality we call it the Dharmakaya. Kaya's body, and Dharma is, of course, the teachings or the phenomena, we call it. So Dharmakaya is the body of oneness, actually. So when we open our eyes to the Dharmakaya, we see that it's empty because it has no content. See? That's the thing about the state, is there's nothing you can pin it down with, and content is fixed. You know? Like the content of, it's like, trying to put a meaning to something. So it has no content. And it's vast because it's without limit. If we set up any kind of boundary, that's not the Dharmakaya. So there's a famous koan about Bodhidharma and Master Wu, the Emperor Wu, Bodhidharma and the Emperor Wu. When Bodhidharma went from India to China, and the emperor asked him, about what merit he gained from building all these stupas and temples, and Bodhidharma said, no merit. And then he said, what is the first holy principle of Buddhism? And Bodhidharma said, vast emptiness, no holiness. So he was talking about the Dharmakaya, vast emptiness. Yeah, there's a famous haiku of Basho, which describes the Dharmakaya. It goes like this. No one walks along this path this autumn evening. It's kind of nice. Who are you? No one walking along this path this autumn evening. Even with a little bit of understanding of the Buddha's enlightenment, it can encourage us and give us great confidence and faith to continue in our practice. You may have heard the quote, we don't practice in order to become enlightened, but because of enlightenment, we practice. But without awakening, what would our practice be? So whenever we think we have it figured out, this is it, everything is one, even that squirts away. Master Jizo said, not knowing is most intimate. The state of not knowing. What is it? That's the most intimate state. In the ox herding pictures, one of the verses in the 8th stage kind of applies to what we're talking about. It goes like this. All worldly desires have fallen away, and at the same time, the meaning of holiness has become completely empty. Do not linger where the Buddha dwells. Go quickly past the place where no Buddha dwells. If a person is no longer attached to either, what is innermost in him can no longer be seen into, not even by him who has 1,000 eyes. So everything has fallen away. See, it doesn't mean that, we're a zombie. No, it means we're free to act according to our true inner nature, which is what? Because everything is one, it has to be compassion and love for everybody and everything. See, but in this very state, in this first line, everything has fallen away. And as one practitioner said, previously I wanted to save the world, but alas, there's no world to save. But there's also a koan, because there's no world to save. We save that world. So let's look at the second line. No wonder they meet without knowing each other. Not knowing is most intimate. When we meet without knowing each other, there's no boundary that separates us. There's a famous story of Zen Master Ryun, who was enlightened upon when he saw peach blossoms falling. And Master Dogen relates his story in his fascicle, The Sound of the Valley, the Color of the Mountain. So Zen Master Ryun practiced the way for over 30 years. Once on a pilgrimage, he rested by a village in spring, and the peach blossoms were everywhere. Upon seeing the blossoms fall, he suddenly attained the way. So we could say that he met them without knowing them. It's like it says in this line of Tozan verse, no wonder they met without knowing each other. And Ryun met the peach blossoms without knowing them. In other words, without having a description or an idea or a thought or a projection or an opinion or a judgment. Just pure sight of the peach blossoms falling. Not even peach blossoms, so no wonder they met without knowing each other. And he composed this poem. For 30 years I have looked for a sword master. Many times leaves fall, new ones sprout. One glimpse of peach blossoms. Now no more doubts, just this. So one of Dogen's successors commented on this experience of Ryun, and also he's commenting on the experience of another monk named Kyogen, who was like a Seppo was a black lacquer ball. He just wasn't able to awaken himself in his practice. He was really frustrated, so he just decided to quit the monastery, and he went to the gravesite of the national teacher, Echu, and he was just going to, he practiced meditation and he took care of the gravesite. And one day when he was sweeping some gravel, hit against a bamboo, and that sound awakened him. And so Koan Ajo was just talking about both of them in this comment. He said, the flowers bloom every year. Nevertheless, not everyone attains enlightenment by viewing them. Stones often strike bamboo. Still, not everyone who hears the sound clarifies the way. Only through the virtue of long study and continuous practice, with the assistance of diligent effort in the way, does one realize the way or clarify the mind. This not occur because the sound of bamboo was especially wonderful, nor because the color of peach blossoms was particularly profound. Although the sound of bamboo is marvelous, it does not sound of itself. It cries out with the help of a piece of tile or a pebble. Although the color of peach blossoms is beautiful of themselves, They open with the help of the spring breeze. The condition of practicing the way is also like this. The way is inherent in each one of us. Still, our gaining the way depends upon the help of fellow practitioners. Though each person is brilliant, still, our practicing the way needs the power of other people in the Sangha. Therefore, unifying your mind and concentrating your aspiration, practice and seek the way together. A jewel becomes a vessel by polishing it. A human being becomes benevolent and wise by refining it. What jewel glitters from its inception? Who is brilliant from the onset? You must polish and refine. So do not demean yourselves and do not relax in your practice of the way. An ancient said, do not spend your time in vain. Now I ask you, does time stop though you hold it dear? And does it continue even though you lament? You must know that it is not time that passes in vain. It is the person who spends it in vain. This means that human beings, just the same as time, have to devote themselves to practice of the way instead of spending their time in vain. So of course, Kyogen, after he was awakened, from the sound of the pebbles, he bowed in the direction of his teacher, and he said, if you had told me the answer, he was bugging his teacher to tell him the answer to a koan. He said, if you told me the answer, I would never have experienced this today. So, with that in mind, whenever I hold you on a koan, it's for your benefit, so that you can experience what Kyogen experienced. Then the last line. There is still the fascination of earlier beauty. Even though you may have experienced this state of emptiness, of dropping away your conceptual mind, dropping away your attachment to your notion of body, what your body is, all of your ideas and thoughts and projections, opinions and judgments, there's still the fascination of earlier beauty. That means there's still clinging on to one's notion of self. It hasn't completely let go. So you don't have to be a megalomaniac to be smitten by your own narcissism. Everyone has an attachment to some version of themselves. So, and is this fascination of what we think is our earlier beauty that will dispel the insight faster than a speeding bullet. Actually, I didn't like that. I tried to come up with a better analogy. To dispel it faster than a skunk at a lawn party. How's that? Hakuin said that the root of all of our delusion is our self-grasping ignorance. Even though we may have seen through it in the evening before the moon shines, it's still hanging around. After all, we're discussing the first stage here. There's still more to clarify. So we're all stuck on our stories of ourselves. And there aren't always pleasant stories, you know. And when we're meditating, you've all experienced this, you'd rather think about something that's terrible and horrible about yourself than just count the breath. Because at least it's my story in all of its horribleness. So the first step is to just recognize that. And so the journey begins, and we notice all of the activity in our mind. And this activity is generally designed to protect our ego identification, to protect it from any kind of intrusion so that it's safe. So some people find safety in their misery, some find safety in aggrandizing themselves, whatever it is, whatever's comfortable, whatever's safe, whatever maintains it. This whole notion of impermanence or emptiness is something that the ego tries to push away because the ego has its own survival mechanisms. The more you sit, the more you are aware of this activity in your mind. You notice how the thoughts arise and persist and then decay. Then you start to see little moments, little gaps between the thoughts. So to study the self is to forget the self. And the more you penetrate into your thoughts, your feelings, your sensations, your conceptions, perceptions, looking for this kernel of who I am, this ego that we've been attached to, it becomes more and more elusive, more and more difficult to grab a hold of. So to study the self is to forget the self. Relevant to this stage, Jack Kornfield, the Vipassana teacher, said, experiences do not in themselves produce wisdom. Some people have had many of these experiences, yet learn very little. Even great openings of the heart, kundalini processes, and visions can turn into spiritual pride and become old memories. As with a near-death experience or a car accident, some people will change a great deal, but others will return to their old constricted habits shortly thereafter. Spiritual experiences in themselves do not count for much. So the difference between falling in love and loving is that falling in love fades to such a degree that it feels as if it's lost. This is comparable to somebody thinking they have lost enlightenment they once had. So the context of love is not dependent upon the momentary experience of cosmic union and ecstasy. Love simply is. If you want love, you must be love. You must manifest love. And how do we do that? When I was studying at the Zen Center of LA with Maizumi Roshi, he often said that compassion is the natural functioning of wisdom. You know, when you see clearly, then compassion arises. And seeing clearly means to see that we're all one and we're all interconnected. So naturally, if we're all one, we don't want to hurt anybody or anything. We want to treat them with loving kindness and care. You know, so is it true or is it just something that they talk about? I actually read about an experiment that was done somewhere in the Northeast. Maybe it was Northeastern University. I can't remember. I look it up. Where they were testing this hypothesis: does meditation lead to compassion? And they had test groups of students. That some of them were given a meditation practice, and others were told that that part of the study was full, but they would bring them in later. But they needed all of them to go to have an interview, and so they would go into the room where the ante room, where like the doctor's waiting office before they went in for the interview, and they had three actors in there. Well, two of them, they were sitting in chairs. Two of them were sitting in chairs, and there was a third chair, and the subject would come in and take the third chair. And then another actor would come in on crutches and would lean against a wall and moan and groan and like they were in great misery. And the test was to see if the subject would get up and offer their seat, because the other two actors in the seats were just indifferent, pretending nothing was going on. It's not my problem. And they found that those who meditated, say with a significant statistical significance, would get up and offer their seat, to the one who was moaning, than the ones who weren't. I don't know if they've repeated the test, but it made me feel good about meditating all these years, and maybe there's some, you see these positive things coming out in the world. Of course, you just have to look at people like Thich Nhat Hanh to know it's so. And I always say to people who tell me that the meditation isn't working, I says, well, most people can't tell themselves. I said, ask your spouse. And we used to have people meditate here whose spouses didn't meditate, and they would say, isn't it about time you went to a session? They found them much more easy to get along with when they came back from session. I found this quote from Reggie Ray, who said, we always want to control our experience, and we always want to get some kind of leverage on what we're going through. Even in terms of religious experience, we want some kind of leverage or some kind of angle so that we can interpret it. But experience is experience, and it's the ego that interprets it as being good or bad, or transformative or not. So I think as a meditator, basically you have to surrender. When you meditate in a serious way, you open your mind up and you explore all the realms, the hell realms as much as the God realms. All of them are a part of the journey and a part of our learning experience. But you cannot really judge them. The minute you start judging them, that's the ego coming and trying to figure it out, trying to create some kind of a safe place for itself to get rid of the bad ones and hang on to the good ones. So the ego can't have an experience of oneness because its very existence is dependent upon it being separate. It actually disturbs the ego very much when there are experiences of oneness, because they begin to undermine the ego's belief in its separate existence. So in the experiences described in this stage, the I is not there. So the I has not realized anything. See? The I wants to take credit for it after it's over. And at the end of his life, the Buddha said, In my 40 years of teaching, I have not uttered a single word. Perhaps you understand what he means. Reclaiming the spiritual territory that ego has appropriated requires sharpening our ability to recognize when ego is running the show and being willing to question the assumptions that we make on the basis of ego's interpretations and agendas. I ran across this quote of Carl Jung, which beautifully explains that you must remember what the ego is, or who you think you are. And he said that in the nativity scene, when the Christ child is born, that the ego is the manger in which the Christ child is born, but it's not the Christ child. So there's a lot of misunderstanding on this. People think that they are going to become enlightened. And that's why we have the third line of the verse. The ego always wants to proudly step forward and take credit for any positive experience we have. It's a very subtle process of having an experience and then realizing it isn't you that had the experience, and letting go, the ego gets attached to the experience. The ego is very resilient and is very quick to take credit for anything that arises that looks attractive or powerful. So we've been talking about the absolute containing the relative, the absolute in the midst of the relative. Early in the evening, before the moon shines, no wonder they meet without knowing each other. For there is still the fascination of earlier beauty. Sometimes we say it's like getting up on the horse and then not wanting to get down. You can't spend your whole life on the horse. All kinds of things are calling. And we'll pursue this further next time. Thank you.